In this film, I'm going to be talking about the concept of God and what we mean by God and some of the different aspects of God that you might be investigating in the philosophy of religion. Now, there's a few terms you need to get your head around if you're just starting out in this subject, and you'll hear them used all the time and you'll see them in books on the subject. The first of these is theism, which just stands for belief in God. So if you're talking about it in an academic way or in a philosophical way, the philosophical opinion that God most likely exists is known as theism, from the Greek theos, God. Now, if you're not sure whether God exists or not, you're commonly referred to as an agnostic. Okay, and it may be that you haven't made your mind up yet, or you think that in principle it could never be determined that God does or does not exist. In those cases, you'd call yourself an agnostic, from the Greek agnosis, no knowledge or not knowledge. The other common term, which is used very regularly in common language, I mean it's not really a technical term, is atheist or atheism, from the Greek a, meaning not, theos, so not believing in God. So if you disbelieve in God, you're commonly referred to as an atheist. And these three, I suppose, are the common philosophical opinions about God's existence: belief that he exists, uncertainty, or disbelief. Now, in recent times, another terms started to be used, which I think is quite interesting because of the development in certain books and some TV shows, and certain popular writers and academics have been referred to as anti-theists. Okay, so rather than just being atheists, although they are atheists, not believing in God, some people go so far as to say that they are opposed to the concept of God. They actually regard it as a bad or a dangerous thing to believe in, not merely false. So sometimes you hear people called anti-theists. But today we're going to set aside the debates about God's existence, and we're just going to look at the concept of God. Now, I would put it to you, starting out in this subject, that we can't just debate about God. Because although it's easy to think that it's a yes-no question, and you either believe or you don't, or you're religious or you're not, I really don't think that's the case. Because I think you have to start off asking what you mean by that in the first place. Do you think that God is just a big old man in the sky? Is he an invisible spirit? Hey, is he even a he? Maybe he's a woman. Maybe he has no gender. I guess if he's a he, she's a she. She's a he. Anyway, very confusing talking about God with no gender, or both genders. Who knows? So I think, therefore, it's very difficult to have a simple debate about God. If you're going to do it philosophically, you really have to start off with some kind of definition or sense of what your view of what God is. So essentially, what a believer has to do to have a philosophical defence of their beliefs is start off setting out how they see God. Now, in that sense, it can be very difficult to do this, and the believers face what I would call a theist's dilemma. That is, on the one hand, a believer will want to say that God is great or awesome, or so far beyond what we can comprehend. But the problem is, the more you emphasise God being beyond, sometimes call that transcendent, is that it's very difficult then to say things justifiably about him. If he's far beyond, then there's less we can say. We can't really say we know something that is greater than what our minds can comprehend. On the other hand, I suppose if a theist wants to say that we can really understand God and we can know him really well, then the more we can relate him to human understanding, perhaps he loses some of that greatness. So it's a very difficult and finely balanced thing, coming up with a definition of God that somebody might want to defend or criticise in the first place. What I want to talk about briefly today, though, is classical theism, and it's a term you'll see used a lot in philosophical literature. What I mean by that is probably the most enduring, popular, sort of elevated or great view of God that's really come through Western philosophy over the centuries. And by Western philosophy, I mean it's really the doctrine that Christians, Jews and Muslims have defended philosophically for a number of centuries. What I mean by classical theism is basically something like the ultimate being, or the greatest being we can think of. The philosopher Saint Anselm, who was Archbishop of Canterbury in the 11th century, probably put this best when he said that God could be defined as the greatest conceivable being. So this idea that God is the best thing we can think about, the best being, is classical theism. Now, this has actually been challenged from a number of quarters. Okay, so some people want to have belief in God, but not this classical sense that God is the greatest being. And therefore there are lots of different theist opinions, right? Not all classical, you might view God in a different way. The range and diversity of those things, though, will take a very long time to explain, and I think we can come back to them on another occasion. What I want to talk about now, though, are what we would call the attributes of God. What I mean by that are his characteristics, okay, his qualities. God, classically defined then as this great being, this ultimate being, must have great or ultimate qualities. Okay, he must be the best. Now that might seem very straightforward because he's the best at everything, the greatest at everything. But when you start to uncover them and scrutinise them and look at them closely, you'll find that each one presents a series of fascinating philosophical puzzles. I won't be able to look at them in depth in this film now, but I'll just flag up a few of the problems which can give you a flavour of how they're interesting things to investigate. Let's start off with omnipotence. Omnipotence, then, is all-powerful, from the Latin omnipotens, or powerful, and it's a key belief of probably just about all mainstream theists today, that God is powerful, that he can do things. But can he do everything? Now, if you look into the Bible, which is of interest to Christians and Jews, then there does seem to be this idea that God is very powerful, tremendously so. And maybe he can do everything. You have the idea that he's the creator of heaven and earth. He performs miracles, he can part the sea, bring the dead back to life, etc. There doesn't seem to be an obvious limit to what he can do in the Bible, anyway. Now, speaking a bit more broadly about why somebody would want to believe that God is all-powerful, I suppose if you have belief in God, then this is a fitting and comforting thing to believe. You want to believe that the object of your devotion is great, that he can do things, that he can make your life for the better, that ultimately the world will come to good. And you can only guarantee that if you're really sure that God is very powerful. So it makes sense to believe, if you do believe in God, that he is great, that he is powerful. However, it's not quite as straightforward as that. Because if you start to think about omnipotence, or powerfulness, the question arises, well, what does that mean? Does it mean that God can do absolutely anything? By that I mean, can God perform any action you can put into words, regardless of whether it makes sense or not? Okay, could he make a dog that is also a cat? Could he be both alive and dead? Could he be both within and without time? Interesting one. But it's most classically put into a little problem or puzzle called the stone paradox. And this goes a bit like this. The question arises for the theist, the supporter of omnipotence, can God make a stone which he is unable to lift? Now it's a problem, it's a catch-22, because either answer seems to cause an omnipotence problem. Firstly, if God can make the stone which he cannot lift, there's something he cannot do, which is namely lift the stone. On the other hand, if God cannot make the stone which he cannot lift, then there is something else he cannot do, which is to make the stone. So either way, it seems to impose a limitation on God. Now, how do you solve this problem? Well, there's loads and loads of books, articles, etc. have been written on this throughout the years. The two most sort of simplistic, straightforward answers, one on the one hand, God can do all of this stuff. Now this might sound very strange, but some people have argued it, that God can both make the stone and lift it. Okay, because God can do unreasonable, illogical things. Absolutely anything. On the other hand, some people argue that what omnipotence therefore means is God can do anything which is logically coherent. Okay? So, it's not logically coherent to be capable of doing something that's impossible, or to be both alive and dead. So that's another possibility. A third possibility, actually, on brief diversion, is that some people say God can do anything that's within his nature to do. Okay, so God can do anything, but for example, he couldn't do something evil because that's not in his nature. And that's just scratching the surface of the omnipotence problem, but hopefully it gives you a taste of what you could investigate. It's not a really simple matter. It's a fascinating matter, this idea of all-powerful. But it's not really immediately clear exactly what you're getting into if you believe it. So I would encourage you to go away and think about that. That leads me on then to the next attribute I want to talk about briefly on this quick tour, and that is omniscience. Omniscience, or all-knowing, is the opinion that God basically knows everything, also from the Latin, omniscientia, or knowledge. Now, again, this is probably a very common, almost universal belief for people who believe in God today. Okay, that God is knowledgeable. He knows you, he knows me, he knows what will happen, what has happened, and this also seems to fit some biblical opinions. Okay, because God seems to know things in the Bible, and then there's some classic phrases of that. Before I formed you in the womb, I knew you. Not a sparrow falls without God's knowledge. And the whole idea of prophecy, if you think about it, includes this idea that God really knows and controls everything that's going on in the world. Why more generally would you want to support omniscience? Well, again, if you have a comforting and significant belief in God that affects the way you live your life, then supposing that God personally knows you is really important, because it's part of your relationship with God. If he knows you, he ought to be able to know everything, and then you're already getting pretty close to knowledge of everything if he's having these sort of personal engagements with all of creation. So it does really, I suppose, make sense for a personal belief in God. However, this isn't that straightforward either, and it causes interesting philosophical problems, just like omnipotence did. Probably the most debated of these problems is the future knowledge problem. That is, if you say God knows everything, the question then arises, does he know the future? Now, on the one hand, the obvious immediate answer is, well, yes, of course he knows the future, because if he knows everything, he must know, well, literally everything, even stuff that hasn't happened yet, because the future will still be real and it's part of reality. Okay, it's like a limitation if you say he doesn't know it. But let's stop for a minute and think, well, what if he does know the future? That is quite a challenging thing to believe, because it means he knows not only what I'm doing or what I've done, but what I will do. Some people say, well, that causes a problem in terms of his relationship with humans. We can't change the path that God has put us on. Has he determined what we'll do? Does that mean we have no freedom? It also might, I suppose, limit God's freedom. God cannot change his mind about something he knows he will do in the future. So, and that just scratches the surface of this puzzle again. You then have to think through the implications and ask yourself, are we happy with this future knowledge thing? I suppose the big kind of output of that, which is a challenge for believers, is that whatever that knowledge is not a knowledge like ours. And it's very hard to understand a being who knows literally everything, past, present, and future. And you cannot have experiences like ours either, if you think about it, because we experience time as durational, and we sort of know the past, but we forget it a bit. We know the present quite well, and we don't know the future. God really knows everything all the time. And his perception of things, his experience, is really not like human experience at all. Now, that might be a problem for you. It might not be, but it certainly deserves some thinking about. Lastly, I want to talk about the attribute of omnibenevolence. Now, omnibenevolence is all-loving, again, Latin, and this is a nice thing to believe, and I suppose it's pretty obvious why people want to think that God is good, because you want to have faith in something that is going to make your life better, or is going to provide comfort, and it's, I suppose, much nicer to believe that some great being loves you than hates you. Also, it's got strong biblical support. There's lots of expression of God's love for humans in the Bible. And it, I suppose, coheres with the idea that God has made a good world, he's created it, and he wants the world to succeed. The big problem for omnibenevolence, though, and this is a problem which deserves a discussion in its own right, is that of why a good and loving God would create a world full of evil and suffering. Okay? It seems strange to say God is all-loving and the creator of unloving things. Okay? Why would an unloving God make a loving God make a world with wars in it? For example, and that's a huge problem. It's a debate that's gone on for centuries and centuries. Can you reconcile his love with what is created? Perhaps that will be the topic of another film at another stage. But there we are. That's another problem. And those, I suppose, are the three classical qualities that believers have wanted to give God. His power, his knowledge, and his love. There's one more interesting aspect of the nature of God I want to talk about briefly, and that is his relationship with time. Now, God's relationship with time is a tricky one because God cannot really exist in the way that humans do. He's not born, lives, dies, dodgy memory, unsure about the future. God's experience of time, whatever that is, isn't very human-like. Now, classically in theism, God has been said to be eternal. That means he is in endless time, but not everlasting. Okay, and that is to say, it's not durational. It's not like God's life starts here, and then it goes on, and then he's just experiencing a never-ending kind of progression through time, just like a human life with no beginning and no end. Eternal doesn't mean endless time in the everlasting sense. It means endless time in the sense of being beyond regular time. As though God is somehow outside of it or able to experience time in a different way. Now, this seems highly abstract and peculiar, and is probably one of the classical theistic opinions that isn't necessarily part of regular religious faith. It's also dubious in a biblical sense, because there's not really discussion of God's relationship with time very clear in the Bible, and certainly isn't an argument that he's outside of time either. So you're probably thinking, well, why would somebody want to come up with this idea of God being eternal? Well, it has a number of significant reasons to support it. And I suppose the way to approach it is to start off saying, well, what's the problem with everlasting? Well, here's the problem with God everlasting, just having a life that goes on and on and on, is that firstly, we'll start off with a future knowledge. If God knows the future just as well as the present and the past, then his experience of past, present, and future are all the same. So if he sees the future just as clearly as the present and past, in what meaningful sense then can you say that his life is durational? Okay, if he sees it all with equal clarity, in a way he's as much part of the future as he is of the present and the past. There's also, I suppose, a connection to omnipotence there. If God is capable of doing anything, then I suppose being everlasting might bind his action. Okay, he couldn't change the past if he's already been through it. Okay, or it's quite difficult to get a sense of how he acts in the future. He has to wait until he gets there. So it's a tricky one. Not every theist believes that God is eternal, however. And some people would argue that you can make a case from being everlasting or having a different relationship with time. This really ends up in different philosophical territory. Because if you're going to start arguing about God's relationship with time, then you have to get into the question of what time is as well. And that then starts to go beyond the remit of the philosophy of religion. And it's almost a physics question, which is one of the wonderful, weird aspects of this subject, that it bumps up against physics all the time. So you have to ask, well, what is time? Can you talk about time in relation to a being which has supposedly created the universe? Can you talk about a being existing apart from time? I would urge you to go and look those things up. They're very interesting. I'm not sure I'm going to venture an opinion on this subject right now. So anyway, those are my initial comments on the concept of God, and hopefully that gives you a sense of some of the problems and the ideas that you're discussing when you're talking about theism. I want to re-emphasise that point I made at the start, that you can't just debate about gods and say, oh yes, no, God exists, or here's my simple answer. It's trickier than that. And you always get asked that question, or at least I do, probably my fault for teaching philosophy and religion. Do you believe in God? And I think in some ways that's a fair question, it's an honest question, but I think for me it often ends up not being a fair question, because I find the concept of God is so manifold and interesting in its own right, and there's so much variety and possibilities available that it's difficult sometimes to pin yourself down to a simple yes or no. I don't think that necessarily makes you an agnostic. It's just, you have to think about what you actually mean by God when you're answering that question. You know, should we believe in classical theism? Maybe, maybe not. A lot of theists reject classical theism, or accept it in part, or really want to redefine God altogether. And so what might start out seeming like a fairly straightforward issue, the existence of God, concept of God, actually turns out to be a very complex problem. And the way in which you provide answers to other questions in the philosophy of religion will depend a lot on your starting point. You know, are you going to argue for God's existence? Well, does he exist outside of the universe? Is he within it? Is he a spiritual being? Does he exist independently of the human mind, etc.? All these questions about the nature of God, to an extent, impact upon then on all the other conversations you're going to have. So starting out reflecting on the classical theistic doctrine of God is a good way to start, but it's only just the barest starting point. What is a much wider conversation to have.